hash the last dance at the rodeo, and why she never left town again. The fiddle started up again just before I hit the ground. I remember that, the way the music kept going like nothing had happened. Like a man getting knocked into the fence rail of the Cutter County Rodeo was just part of the evening's entertainment. Maybe it was. I lay there in the dirt with my ear pressed to the earth, and I could feel the bass drum through the ground, 2 feet of packed clay between me and the dance floor of the pavilion, thump, 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 and a boot came down about 6 inches from my face. It belonged to Deke Harlan. I knew those boots before I knew anything else about the situation. Deke had worn the same pair since '38, brown cowhide, left toe worn down to a scuff from how he dragged it when he walked. 8 years I'd been looking at those boots. My brother's boots now, I supposed, since that was what Cutter County had decided. My brother's boots, my brother's ranch, my brother's name on everything that had once carried my own. "Stay down, Russ," he said. Not a threat. He said it like he was tired. Like he'd been saying it for years, which I suppose he had, just not out loud until then. I stayed down. Not because he told me to, I stayed down because I didn't have the particular argument left in me that getting up would have required. My ribs had something wrong with them. My mouth had the iron taste. The fiddle was playing Asterisk Redwing or something close to it, and the dance was going on 20 feet away, and I was 39 years old lying face down in Cutter County dirt, and I had come back here for a reason I couldn't fully name anymore. That was the last dance at the Cutter County Rodeo for me. I didn't know it yet, but that's where it starts, in that dirt with the music going, with Deke's boots walking away. I'll back up some so this makes sense. My name is Russell Cade. I was born on the Cade Ranch, which sits in the northeast corner of Cutter County, New Mexico, and which was called the Cade Ranch for 50 years before I was born and for another 40 after. Right up until about 6 years ago when Deke's lawyers finished what Deke's lawyers started, and it stopped being called that on any document that mattered. The ranch had been my father's. My father had been a hard, quiet man who raised cattle and kept to himself and loved the land the way some men love a woman, not with any softness in it, but with a permanence that wasn't going to move for anything. He died in '39. The will he left said the ranch went to both of us, me and Deke, equal shares, joint ownership. Neither of us could sell without the other's signature. What my father couldn't have predicted was that Deke would find a lawyer clever enough to argue that my absence constituted abandonment. I had been absent, I'll give Deke that. I'd left Cutter County in '34 when I was 27, and I'd left the way a man leaves when there's a thing behind him he can't outrun by staying. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. What matters is that I was gone for 11 years, working ranches in Colorado, then up into Wyoming for a stretch, 2 years on a timber crew outside of Taos. And when I came back in 1945, it was because my father was 3 years dead, and the letter had finally caught up to me. And I stood at the gate of the Cade place and watched Deke come out of the house that should have been half mine with a look on his face that told me what the letter hadn't. There had been a hearing. I hadn't known about a hearing. There was a ruling. There was a piece of paper. My name was gone. I stayed in Cutter County anyway. I don't know exactly why. Pride, maybe. The stubbornness that my father said was my only inheritance from him. I took a room above Nettleton's hardware store, and I hired on with the Beaumont outfit doing fence work, and I watched my brother run my father's land, and I waited for the thing I was waiting for without being able to say what it was. That was me, the summer of 1946 going into the fall, a man waiting without a name for the thing he was waiting for. Then the rodeo came around. The Cutter County Rodeo happened every September. It was 3 days of riding and roping, and the kind of controlled chaos that small towns use to remind themselves they're still alive. And on the last night, there was always a dance in the pavilion near the fairgrounds, and everybody came. The Harlan family always had a table near the front because the Harlans were the Harlans. Deke had taken my name when he took my land, which is a thing I never got fully used to saying, but there it is. I went to the dance the way I'd been going to things in Cutter County since I got back, quietly, staying at the edges, not because I was shy, but because I had learned to take up less space. A man who takes up less space causes fewer fights, and I had no stomach for fighting over things that weren't going to change by fighting. I saw her at the punch bowl. Now I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds, and I don't want it to sound like what it probably sounds like. I was not a man looking for a woman. I was not standing at the edge of a dance scanning the room with intention. I needed a drink of something cold because the night was still warm for September and I'd been standing outside for an hour. And when I came into the pavilion and made my way toward the refreshment table, she was there. And she was the first thing that had made me stop moving in 6 years. Her name was Clara Metcalf. She'd come to Cutter County about 8 months before I got back, which meant she was one of the few people in town who didn't have a ready opinion about me or my family or the business with the ranch. She taught school, the little stone schoolhouse on Arroyo Road, 23 children grades 1 through 6. She was from somewhere in Texas originally, the eastern part, and she had that look about her that East Texas women sometimes have, like the humidity left a kind of steadiness in them that drier country doesn't produce. She wasn't beautiful the way that word gets overworked. She was, I'll try to say it right, she was the kind of woman whose face became more itself the longer you looked at it. Fine jaw, dark hair she kept pinned but which had come loose on one side from the heat of the dancing. She was holding a cup of punch, and she was watching the fiddle player with the particular attention of someone who was actually listening, not just waiting for the next thing. I came up for a drink and she looked over and I nodded, and she nodded back, and that was the first time. We didn't speak that night. Deke got to me before the second number ended. I still don't know what set him off that particular evening. Liquor, probably, or the combination of liquor, and the fact of my continued existence in a county that he'd spent 2 years trying to convince himself he owned outright. He came across the pavilion with that dragging left boot and 3 of his men behind him, and he said something. I honestly don't remember what. The blood was already in my ears. And I said something back. And then we were outside, and it was over very quickly, and I was in the dirt. Thump, thump, thump. I'll tell you something about lying in dirt with your ribs sprung. You become very particular about things, the weight of your own arm. Whether the ground under your cheek is smooth or rough. The specific quality of the dark above you, whether it's the dark of a clear sky or an overcast one. That night it was clear, some stars already out though it was only 8 in the evening, and I lay there cataloging sensations because cataloging sensations was the thing I could do while breathing was complicated. I heard the pavilion door. Footsteps on the hard-packed yard. Not Deke's, these were lighter, quicker. I didn't move. I had decided not to move for a while yet, and I was committed to that. She crouched down. Not where I could see her face at first. She came up beside me, and I was aware of a hand on my shoulder, not a tentative hand, but a settled one, like she'd thought about it on the way over and decided that was where her hand was going. "Can you turn over?" she said. "In a minute." Are you telling me to wait or telling me you need a minute? Probably both. She waited. I took the minute. Then I got my arms under me and pushed up and sat in the dirt, and she was there, Clara Metcalf, with her hair half down and a look on her face that wasn't pity. I want to be clear about that, because pity was the last thing I wanted, and I think I would have stood up and walked off if that's what it had been. What it was instead was assessment. She was looking at me the way you look at a fence post to decide if it needs to come out or just needs resetting. "Your mouth is bleeding," she said. "I know." She produced a handkerchief from somewhere. Her sleeve, I think. She was the kind of woman who kept things in her sleeve. And she handed it to me, and I pressed it to the corner of my mouth. "Who was that?" she asked. "My brother." She absorbed that without much reaction. "Is this a regular occurrence?" "More regular than it used to be. Less regular than it will probably become." "That's a grim arithmetic," she said. "It's an honest one." The music had shifted to a waltz. I could hear the shuffle of feet through the pavilion wall. She was still crouching, which couldn't have been comfortable, and I was still sitting in the dirt, which was certainly not. And there was a moment where the 2 of us were just there in the particular quiet that exists underneath a band playing, and I remember thinking, this woman has no good reason to be out here. I said it out loud, not the whole thing, just, "You didn't have to come out." "I know that," she said, like it was obvious. Like the fact that she'd chosen to wasn't something that needed any particular acknowledgement. I looked at her directly then. For the first time properly, not the sideways look at the punch bowl, not with my face in the dirt, but straight on. She looked back. "I've seen you around," she said. "In town. I've seen you. You do fence work for Beaumont. Among other things. And you used to own the Cade Ranch," she said, Or half of it. That's a thing people know about me. People talk about it the way they talk about weather, she said. Like it just happened, like nobody decided anything. Something in me went still. I didn't say anything. My father lost land, she said, in East Texas. A man named Dodd decided the lease agreement meant something different from what my father signed. There were lawyers. She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. I know what it looks like when it just happened to someone. She offered her hand to help me up. I looked at it. 39 years old, beaten up in the dirt outside a dance hall, and a schoolteacher from East Texas was offering her hand. I could have stood on my own. I could have. I took her hand. We didn't become anything right away. I want to be honest about that because the story I've told up to this point sounds like it's building toward something sudden, and it wasn't. We were two people who started talking at the edge of a thing and then kept talking because the talking was good. She came into Nettleton's hardware 3 days after the rodeo. She needed a hinge for one of the schoolhouse windows, she said, and Nettleton's was the only hardware in town. I was helping Nettleton move stock that week, filling in while his regular hand was sick. She came in and she saw me, and there was the same moment of assessment, and then she said, "How are the ribs?" And I said they were improving, and she said she was glad to hear it, and then she bought her hinge and left. 2 weeks after that I was eating supper at Merle Condon's cafe, and she came in alone and took the table across the room, and we ate our separate suppers, and then she said something across the cafe about the weather. Something dry and accurate about how September in Cutter County always promised a change that never came. And I said something back, and we ended up at the same table for coffee, and that was how it went. I'll tell you what I liked about talking to Clara Metcalf. She didn't ask me questions the way most people asked questions, which is to say she didn't ask questions as a way of positioning herself. She asked questions because she wanted to know things. And she listened to the answer not the way people pretend to listen while they're constructing their response, but with her full attention, her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on your face, and a quality of stillness that made you want to say the actual thing, not the thing you said in place of it. I told her more about my father in one supper than I'd told anybody in 11 years of wandering. I told her about the ranch, not the loss of it, but what it was. The north pasture where the grass came in short and thick, and the cattle always grazed toward the fence line by late summer. The windmill my grandfather built that still ran on the original mechanism, just oiled every 3 years. The way the house smelled in October when my mother used to bake, and the smell would get into the walls, and the cold would press it back out. My mother, I hadn't talked about my mother in a long time. Clara listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "You should get it back." I said I'd looked into it. The ruling had been properly entered. She said, "I didn't ask what the law said. I asked if you tried." There was something almost sharp in that. Not unkind, just certain. Like a woman who had learned not to accept the first answer the world gave her. I thought about that for a while after I walked back to my room above Nettleton's. I thought about it longer than felt comfortable. October came, and with it the cold that September had promised and not delivered. The Beaumont fencing work was done for the season, and I had part-time work at the grain elevator in town, but mostly I had time, which was its own kind of problem. I'd been picking up work from a man named Hollies who ran a small law practice in Deming, 40 miles south, not legal work. Hollies knew I wasn't a lawyer, but he had a business on the side processing property claims and filing paperwork, and he needed someone who could ride and read and follow instructions. It was dull work, but it got me into county records offices across southern New Mexico, and I had started quietly to pull the thread on my own situation. The thing I found was not simple. The abandonment ruling had been filed in 1942. I'd been in Wyoming then. There had been a 30-day notification period. The county had published a notice in the Cutter County paper, which was the legal requirement, and nobody had expected me to see it because nobody knew exactly where I was. The ruling stood. Deke had been the sole heir of record for 4 years before I came back. But Hollies, when I laid it out for him, pulled on his ear and said there was a question about the original joint tenancy language and whether abandonment could sever one party's rights in that specific configuration. He wasn't sure. He said he'd have to look. I want to be clear that I didn't tell Clara any of this. She'd said her piece at the cafe, and I wasn't going to come back to her with a progress report like she was my supervisor. She was a woman I had coffee with sometimes. She was the best conversation I'd had in years. Those were two separate things. Except they started not to be quite so separate around November. She had taken to walking the long way home from school on Fridays, down Caldwell Street past the grain elevator, which was not the direct route to her boarding house by any reasonable measure. I noticed this the second Friday it happened, and I was out front stacking bags when she came by, and she stopped and said, "Cold enough now?" And I said it was, and she said she'd heard Holly's name in connection with mine from someone at the county recorder's office. I said that was possible. She said, "Are you doing something about it?" I said maybe. She looked at me for a moment in that way she had. Then she said, "Good," and walked on. Just that good. I stood there in the cold with a 50-pound feed sack balanced on my shoulder and something in my chest that I recognized as warmth, which I hadn't felt in a long time. The particular warmth of being seen doing a thing before you finished it, of someone knowing without you having to say it. November went hard. The thing I haven't told you yet came back. I said I left Cutter County in '34 because of something behind me. Here's the short of it. My father had a falling out with a man named Garver over water rights creek that ran across Garver's land before it hit ours, and it turned into the kind of dispute that lasts for years and poisons everything around it. Garver had a son, Teddy, who was my age, and Teddy and I had been friends until we weren't, until the dispute made us not. And in '34 there was a night and there was a horse and there was a fall, and Teddy Garver died, and I had been there. It was an accident. I know that. It was late, we were both drinking, we'd been arguing about the water and about the fact that we'd been friends and weren't anymore, and Teddy took his horse up the creek bank fast and in the dark and the horse went down in the rocks. I was 50 yards behind him. I didn't cause it, but I had been there and I was alive and he wasn't, and the Garver family did not make that distinction. By '34, the Garvers had convinced most of Cutter County that I'd run Teddy off the creek bank intentionally. No charges were ever filed because there was no evidence. But that's the other thing people in Cutter County knew about me, the thing they talked about in lower voices than the ranch, the thing that lived underneath all the rest of it. Deke knew. Deke had always known it was an accident, but Deke was smart enough to let the Garver story run because it cleared the field for him. A man nobody trusted had no standing to fight for much of anything. What happened in November was that one of the Garver cousins, a man named Price Garver who'd come back to the county after a stretch in the Army, decided that my presence in Cutter County was an ongoing affront that needed correcting. Not through the law, through other means. He came to the grain elevator one morning when I was there alone. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He had 2 men with him and the math was obvious, and when they left I had a message that was clear enough. I needed to be somewhere else. I went back to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about it. I had left once before. It had not solved the problem. It had, in fact, produced the conditions under which Deke was able to take everything. Leaving was what they wanted. Leaving was exactly the move that cost me every time. But I was also one man with a sprung rib that hadn't fully healed, no friends in the county to speak of, and the kind of history that made it easy for people to look away. I sat on that bed for a long time. Clara came to the grain elevator the next morning. She came in the front, and Hector, who ran the loading dock, told me there was a woman asking for me. And I came through, and she was standing in the front room with the dust motes moving in the cold light from the door, and she had a look on her face I hadn't seen before. I said, "Price Garver talked to you." She said, "He came to the school." I felt something cold that wasn't the November air. She said, "He wanted me to tell you," his words, "that the situation was reaching a conclusion, and you should factor that into your planning." "He threatened you." "He spoke to me," she said carefully, "in a way that was intended to be threatening. Whether it succeeded is a different question." I looked at her. She was steady. Her hands were at her sides, not twisted together, not pulling at anything. She was steady the way a wall is steady, not because nothing is hitting it, but because the foundation is right. "I'm sorry," I said. "That he came to you, you shouldn't be part of this." "You should sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing." "Russ," she said it quietly, not sharply. "Just said my name like a person will sometimes say a name when they need you to actually hear them. Sit down." I sat down on a feed bag. She pulled a stool from behind the counter and sat across from me, and she folded her hands in her lap and she said, I need you to tell me the whole thing, not the version people tell, the actual thing. I looked at her for a moment, then I told her. I told her about Teddy Garver and the creek and the night in 34. I told her about the rocks and the dark and the horse going down and the sound of it, which I still had, a specific sound I could still hear at 3 in the morning sometimes, the sound of a living thing ceasing to be. I told her how I'd tried to pull him clear and couldn't. I told her I'd gone to his father and said I was sorry, and his father had looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. I told her the whole thing, the actual thing. When I was done, the grain elevator was quiet, except for the wind against the corrugated walls. "You've been carrying that for 12 years, she said, not a question. "Closer to 13. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you believe the Garvers know it was an accident?" I thought about it. Price, maybe not. He was young when it happened. He's been told a story. Teddy's father, I stopped. Teddy's father knows. I think he's always known. I think he needed someone to hold the weight, and I was available. Then Price Garver is acting on a lie someone fed him. That doesn't make him less dangerous. No, she said, but it changes what can be done. I asked her what she meant. She said Teddy Garver's father is still alive. He's on the old homestead out on the Mesilla Road. He's 70-some years old, and from what I hear his health is poor. She paused. I think you should go see him. I stared at her. I think, she said, that whatever he says to you or doesn't say to you, you should go see him, before this gets to a place where someone decides the only way through it is something permanent. I said, you're talking about me going to the man whose son died while I was there and asking him, what? To call off his nephew. I'm talking about you going to the man whose son died while you were there, she said, and being in the same room with him, without the story between you. Just two men who were both there in a way and who have been carrying it ever since. She paused. You said he knows. If he knows, then maybe he's been carrying something too. I sat with that for a long time. The wind hit the corrugated wall. She sat across from me on the stool with her hands folded, and she waited. Not impatiently. Just waited like she had time, like she believed that if she gave me enough of it, I would find my way to the right answer on my own. Finally, I said, that is either the bravest idea I've ever heard or the worst one. Could be both, she said. I find those aren't always as separate as people think. Something, I don't know, some tightness that had been in me for longer than I could measure went somewhere else for a moment. Not gone, just moved. I looked at her sitting on that stool in the grain elevator dust with the cold light coming through the door, and I thought, this woman walked into Price Garver's message and came through it and sat down on a feed stool in a grain elevator and told me to go see a man I'd been afraid of for 13 years. Why are you doing this? I said. She looked at me like the question surprised her. Then she said, because you're worth doing it for. Plain as that, no decoration. Just put it down in front of me like a thing she'd already decided. I didn't know what to do with that. I just sat with it. I went to see Harlan Garver on a cold morning in late November. I rode out alone. I didn't tell Clara I was going. She'd made the suggestion, and I'd sat with it for 2 weeks, and then one morning I saddled the horse I'd borrowed from Beaumont and rode out the Mesilla Road before I could talk myself out of it. The Garver place was smaller than I remembered. It always is, the things you've been afraid of when you finally get back to them. A low adobe house with a rusted windmill and 3 horses in a pen that looked like they'd been put out to wait for something. A dog barked when I came up the road and then went quiet. I tied the horse and knocked. Harlan Garver answered the door. He was old. He was very old, and I hadn't expected that, which was stupid because it had been 12 years and he'd been old then. He was bent in the shoulders, and his face was the color of dried leather, and his eyes were Teddy's eyes. I hadn't expected that either, the specific shade of them, brown going to amber at the center. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, Russell Cade. I said, yes, sir. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he said, come in. We sat at his kitchen table. He didn't offer me anything, and I didn't ask for anything, and we sat there with the November light coming through the small window, and neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, you came to talk about Price. I said, partly. He said, and the other part. I said, I wanted to come a long time ago. I should have come a long time ago. I'm sorry that I didn't, and I'm sorry about Teddy, and I am sorry that I was there that night and couldn't do anything that mattered." The room was very quiet. He looked at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man who had worked outside for 50 years, ridged and spotted, and the knuckles enlarged. He turned them over, palm up, then back. He said, "I know you didn't run him off that bank." The room stayed quiet. He said, "I knew it then. Teddy rode hard in the dark when he was drinking. I told him since he was 16 years old." He paused. "After he died, I needed somewhere to put it. You were there, your family was already the wrong family for us." He stopped again. "I've thought about that in the years since, whether I did you a wrong." I said, "I think you were a father who lost his son." He looked up, those amber-brown eyes. "The story got away from me," he said. "Price came back from the army full of something that needed an enemy, and I didn't stop it when I should have. I let him believe what was easier to believe." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to talk to him." "You don't have to do that for me," I said. "I'm doing it because it's right," he said. "There's a difference." He looked at me. "You know about doing things because they're right." I didn't know what to say to that. I sat with it. When I left, he walked me to the door and we shook hands. Old man's grip still strong, the kind of strength that doesn't leave until the very end. He held on for a moment and he said, "Your father was a good man, we just wanted the same water." He let go. "Go get your land back, son." I rode back to town with the cold in my face, and the flat winter sky overhead, and something in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. Not peace, exactly. Something older and harder and more honest than peace. The thing that happens when you finally put down a weight you've been carrying so long you stopped knowing it was there. December. Holly's in Deming had found the thing he was looking for. The joint tenancy language in my father's original deed used a specific phrase that under New Mexico property law meant something different from standard joint tenancy. It was closer to a tenancy in common, Holly said, and abandonment doctrine applied differently. The county attorney, when Holly's brought it to him, was uncomfortable. There was going to be a hearing in January. I told Clara over coffee at the cafe. She listened to the whole thing, and when I was done, she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Uncertain. There's no guarantee." She said, "I didn't ask about the hearing. I asked how you feel." I thought about it, I said, "Like I'm fighting for something real for the first time in a long time, whether I win or not." She nodded like that was the right answer. We sat there a while. The cafe was mostly empty, a Thursday afternoon, the heater going in the corner and the cold outside the window making the glass fog at the edges. She had her coffee cup. I had mine. I said, "Why did you stay in Cutter County?" She looked up. "You came here for one school year," I said. "That's what I heard. 1 year, then you were going to Albuquerque. There was a school there, but you stayed." She was quiet for a moment. "The children need a teacher," she said. "There are children in Albuquerque." She looked out the window, then she looked back. "I had a reason to stay," she said. "It took me a while to understand what it was." I looked at her. She said, "You're a careful man, Russ." "People have said that's a fault." "No," she said, "careful is right. Some things need to be treated carefully." She looked at her coffee cup. "I don't need you to be quick about it." I sat there, the heater ticked. "I'm not a straightforward proposition," I said. "I know that. I have a brother who hates me, and a property dispute going to court in January, and a history in this county that doesn't wash out." "I know all of that," she said. "I chose this county knowing all of that." She looked at me. "I'm not a woman who makes mistakes about where she puts her time." The heater ticked. Outside the window, the cold afternoon was doing what it did, the light going early, the sky the flat pewter color that December gets in New Mexico, everything pared down and bare and honest. I looked at her face across the table. The jaw, the dark hair, the eyes that had never once looked at me with anything that wasn't clear and direct and freely given. I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers. She turned her hand and took mine. Just that, held it. No particular drama to it, just a woman who had already decided and a man who was finally catching up. We sat like that for a while with the heater going and the cold outside. January hearing. Holly's argued for 2 hours. The county attorney argued back. The judge was a man named Pickard who I'd never met, which was good, no history there. He took everything under advisement and said he'd rule in 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, he ruled in my favor. Not the whole thing, not a clean reversal, because it was never going to be that clean. What I got was a partition order requiring Deke to either buy out my half interest at fair market value or agree to a physical partition of the land. Deke didn't have the cash to buy me out. What he had was the north section and the south section, and the house and the barn all mixed together in a way that didn't partition easy, and his lawyer told him that. And what happened over the next month was a negotiation that I'll spare you the details of because it was mostly dull and occasionally ugly, and ended with me owning the north pasture, and the water rights and 40 acres around the old windmill that my grandfather built. It wasn't the whole ranch, it wasn't half the ranch, but it was land with my name on it. Land my grandfather's windmill stood on, land my father had worked. I stood at the fence line on a cold February morning and looked across the north pasture, and the grass came in short and thick the way it always had, and the cattle that I didn't yet own were grazing toward the fence line the way they always did by late February, and the windmill turned in the wind with the sound it had always made. A particular creak on the third turn that I hadn't heard in 12 years and knew immediately when I heard it again. Clara was beside me. She had driven out with me, which was not a big statement in words, but was a statement in every other way. She stood at the fence in her coat with her hands in her pockets, and she looked out at the pasture the way you look at something you're being introduced to for the first time but intend to know well. I didn't say anything for a while, neither did she. Then she said, "It's good land." I said it was. She said, "The windmill sounds like it needs the left bearing looked at." I said it always sounded like that. It was how you knew it was running right. She looked at me sideways, a small thing at the corner of her mouth that was almost a smile. "You'll need cattle," she said. "I know. And someone to help you set up the house." I looked at her. She was looking at the pasture, practical, settled, like a woman who had already decided and was talking about logistics now. "Clara," I said, "is this you asking if I need help setting up a house, or is this you telling me you're going to?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Russ, I told you I'm not a woman who makes mistakes about where she puts her time." She paused. "And I'm not a woman who left Cutter County, remember." I remembered. The title of this thing, the reason you're listening, why she never left town again. I thought I understood it when I started telling this. A woman who stayed in a county she'd meant to leave. I thought it was about her decision in December at the cafe. But standing there at the fence line with the windmill turning and the cattle grazing toward the wire and the February cold in my face, I understood it differently. She hadn't left town in December because of a decision she made. She'd stopped leaving the day she walked out the pavilion door at the Cutter County Rodeo and found a man lying in the dirt and decided he was worth crouching down for. That was the thing, the simple thing. She had looked at me, at everything I was, everything I'd lost, everything that had been done and everything I'd failed to do, and she had not looked away. A woman like that, you don't question it. You don't make her prove it twice. You just take her hand and you're grateful for the grace of it. We were married in April. The judge who performed the ceremony was not Pickard. Pickard was a county judge, and we wanted someone farther from the proceedings. We went to Deming, which was fitting because Deming was where Holly's worked, and Holly's had started the chain of things. And we said what we had to say in a small office with 2 of Holly's clerks as witnesses, and then we drove back to Cutter County. That night we sat on the porch of what was now our house, a small house I'd put up on the 40 acres around the windmill, rough-built but solid, 2 rooms and a porch that looked north over the pasture. And the April evening was warm for once, the kind of warmth that April promises and usually fails to deliver, and the windmill was turning in the faint breeze, creak on the third turn. She was in the other chair. We had 2 chairs. That was the whole of the porch furniture. Her feet were up on the rail, and she had a cup of tea, and the last of the evening light was on her face, and she was watching the windmill. I looked at her. I thought about the rodeo and the dirt and the boot 6 inches from my face. I thought about a woman crouching down. I thought about a grain elevator in November and a kitchen table in an old man's house and a January courtroom and the specific sound of a windmill I'd known since childhood. I thought about what it meant that she was here, what it meant that I was. 39 years old and beaten down, and hollowed out in some ways that I won't pretend got completely fixed. Some things don't fix. They just become part of the structure, load-bearing in a way you couldn't have planned. And I had land with my name on it, and a woman in the chair beside me who had seen the whole of me and stayed. She said, without looking away from the windmill, "What are you thinking?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "You think loud for a quiet man." I said, "I'm thinking that I've been in this county for most of my life, and this is the first time it's felt like mine." She looked over. "It is yours," she said. "It was always yours, you just had to come back to it." The windmill turned, creak on the third turn. I put out my hand, and she took it the way she had in the cafe. No drama, no ceremony, just a woman who had already decided, holding on. The evening went soft around us. The pasture went blue-gray in the last light. Somewhere on the north fence line, a night bird started up, and the windmill turned, and the April warmth held. That's where it ends, right there. A man on a porch with his land in front of him, and a good woman's hand in his, and the sound of a windmill his grandfather built still turning in the dark. That's all I've got to tell you. And